everyone. It is I'm in Toronto right now, and it's sorry, I just see it's being recorded, so great. So hi everyone, I'm in Toronto right now. We've had a few really nice days where we're like, ooh, maybe there's going to be summer or spring coming, and now today is very gloomy, so it's wonderful to be in a room with all of you today. So as Tamika was saying, my name is Dr. Samantha Cotrera, and I am a history education strategist based in Toronto, Canada. As a history education strategist, I help institutions and organizations and individuals teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive. And what that means for me is history and social studies education that has a lean towards things like equity, of course, but also affective, emotional, creative, imaginative responses to education, to history, to the stories that frame our lives. Because I think that without that kind of affective, emotional, imaginative, creative conversations with the past, we aren't going to find the spaces for equity and justice that we need in order to rebuild the future to be one that is more equitable and more just and has that embraces greater diversity of experiences and people and stories from the past. And so that has always been my kind of push for history education. I've been doing this work for about 15 years. And in March, and you know what happens in March. But in March, at the beginning of the year, in beginning of 2020, I was like, I want to start a video series, just a small video series, talking to mainly teachers, history teachers, and other history educators. So maybe an archivist that does education in their archives. I want to just do a small video series talking about a couple different themes to think about things like inclusivity and transformation in history education, radical approaches to history education. So let me just do this small video series, and I was really excited about it. Let me just flip over to the main page. I called it Imagining a New We because although I thought it'd be a great idea to talk with teachers, I also had a book coming out that did get published in September. I'm very excited, called Transforming the Canadian History Classroom, Imagining a New We. And the idea was that I can bring some of these ideas to a video audience. Just give me 1 second. I want to close the window. Because it's a little rainy, I hear the rain, and I'm sure you might as well. So the video series started with these videos on what is meaningful learning, historical empathy. I talk about connection, complexity, and care, something I talk a lot about in my book. I focus on figures in Canadian history, because again, I'm from Canada, like Louis Riel. We had a strike in Ontario, which is our province. Our state, if you're American. And so I was talking about covering labor in history education. I went away to a conference where I was talking about digital humanities. And so here I am in sunny Florida in February, 11 months ago. And here you can see this video here about resources to historicize the flu. Most of the videos are very well lit. And this one, I came home after the WHO declared the pandemic, and I was like, okay, here are some resources. And then I said, how do we teach history after this? Because when the pandemic came, when we went into lockdown, I'm walking around my neighborhood, my urban neighborhood, and I have all these buildings around me, and I'm walking around and I'm thinking, the historical record will never capture all these experiences in these buildings. What are we doing trying to teach history during this time? What are we doing in terms of even writing history during this time? Is this going to be is this not going to be worthwhile? Is history and social studies education going to seem like navel gazing when all of a sudden the schools are all closed and most governments are really focusing on the 3 R's, what is history going to happen after this? And also just selfishly, I'm thinking about my poor little book where I argue that community-based history education, where you're swapping out Post-it notes and creating these large class mind maps, and you're sharing stories in class, and you're presenting, and you're being in a room together. Like, does this even make any sense anymore? How do we imagine a new we when we're siloed in our homes, when we're not supposed to be together? Now, I'm sure you can say, like, oh, this is why history education is even more important in this moment. And like, of course, you're right. But those first few days of lockdown, like, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about the kids that they're saying, like, well, how do we teach them math? Like where is history and social studies education going to land? So I didn't know what to do with the video series. And so I did this little video where I said, how do we teach history after this? And I have called it, when I've written some blog posts about it, quite maudlin. Like, I'm just like, oh my God, like, what are we going to do? And you can see like the difference in views, for example, because I started sharing it with people, and like people in my communities were like, well, yeah, I'm thinking about those things too. And so all of a sudden, rather than do these like little videos that I've really enjoyed, I didn't do a lot of promotion for them. Like it was just going to be like a thing that lived, and it was just going to be me. All of a sudden, I started talking to other people about these very questions. And I had 3 questions that I started asking people about around this question of how do we teach history after this. Going to flip over to show you what those questions are. So those questions that I started to ask people are you thinking of history any differently because of COVID-19? Because, and if you've watched any of the videos, I feel like I've said this a million times, I certainly had. Now, in retrospect, maybe my ideas hadn't moved that far from where I started, but it felt much more acute, this notion of storying our experiences. Like, are we ever going to be able to really story in a historical record accurately? Because those are the things that we like when we're talking about historical records, of course. The anxiety of the moment, and how the anxiety was different for people within small spaces, just like even in a home. So I did start thinking about history differently. And I realized things like, World War I or World War II or the Spanish flu pandemic, like we really don't know the emotional landscape of those histories. And so we have to always think of history in those ways. So I did start thinking of history a little differently because of that. Do you think we should teach history different after COVID? Do you think we will? And so this question here is what I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about. And then my third question is, do you think there are more possibilities to imagine a new we? Because that is coming from the title of the video series and my book, during or after this. And when I say imagining a new we, I mean either through this notion of imagining, so through creation, or through a collective coming together of a new or different collective. So there's a lot of different ways in. When I got some feedback from that first video of how do we teach history after this, I wanted to give people some parameters. That's why the questions came. But I really started being so intrigued by people's ideas around this. And so I started reaching out to my networks. Are you interested in talking about this? I know you're busy, but are you interested in talking about this? Are you like, here are these 3 questions. It'll take 10, 15 minutes, it'll just be a quick conversation. And what happened was I wound up talking to 40 people between the end of March and the end of June in 2020 around those 3 questions. Are you thinking of history any different because of this? Should we teach history different after this? And do you think we'll be able to imagine a new we in different ways after this? I've actually done over 100 videos since I started, but the video part or the series I'm talking about are the immediate ones right after COVID. It's from March to June. I took a break in the summer. It didn't feel much of a break. And I started September to December, although it was a little bit different then. And I'm taking a break now, but I'm hoping that you all will be interested in me not taking a break after this. So I spoke to a variety of different people. I spoke to historians. I'm based in Canada. While I put the word out on social media in every introduction of the video, while I emailed people far and wide that I didn't even know, most of the people I spoke to were in my little Ontario circle, but I did get to meet people that I hadn't met before. But most of these people are Canadian. So I spoke to historians. I spoke with public historians. And I should say that the conversations I had with public historians, okay, first, I always want to be like, this one's my favorite. And the fact is, they're all my favorite. Nothing that I'm showing you today is better or worse than any of the other ones. So like, you should watch or listen to them all. But there was something about the public historians, the ways that they were approaching this notion of history. Like Joe McGill from the Slave Dwelling Project, he would say, like, people are going to need to change the ways that we are interpreting historical museums because you're going to lose audiences. You need to now build audiences. But someone like Kate Ackerfield from Toronto's First Post Office, who it's a very, very small museum in Canada, she was also like, we're not only thinking of how to change like the medium because we all have to, but what it means for the messages. And I just thought they were just so fantastic, the ways public historians got in touch with these conversations. I also talked to a lot of teacher educators. I got to speak to teacher educators in the States, as well as in Australia and in Canada, of course. I got to talk with librarians and archivists. Neil Orford, actually, at the top, isn't really a librarian or archivist, but he is kind of one de facto. But it was awesome to be able to speak to people that are working with records, working with a different type of approach to history. I also got to talk with teachers, not as much as I wanted to because teachers were so busy. All of these teachers, if I remember correctly, are from Ontario. And I got so many nice emails from teachers being like, I'm watching the videos, I'm just too busy to like have a conversation about it. And I totally get it, because every conversation I had with teachers were so rich, but it was also based in a lot of fear of what's to come. And that's something that I want to talk a little bit about when we get into the discussion. Now, I just showed you a whole bunch of videos, but like, these are also videos that I did, and they were all so fantastic. Like, these ones weren't any better than these ones. They were all just amazing, the people I got to talk with. But what I found is that the further we were getting into the summer, so the further we were away from the initial March declaration, the more the questions, especially about, do you think we should teach history differently after this? The more they went from, we definitely will, we definitely can, to a little less of that push. And I don't want to put any onus on the teachers, the educators, or the historians, or the scholars themselves. It wasn't them. It was the atmosphere. It was the fact that things we're thinking about September or August. In Canada, we usually start schools in September. And all of a sudden, there was this notion of greater practicality. So while all of these conversations really focused on things like greater equity, greater approach to records, greater ways of questioning the ways that records shape how we understand the narrative, and we can use this COVID moment to think differently about narratives, the ways that we can think more broadly about the types of histories that we are engaging with, the ways that we can think more about the intersection between politics and self. Like, we were able to talk about all these different things. But when it came down to, are we actually going to teach history differently after this moment, there was far less of a way to say, yes, we are. And so I'm working on an article right now that summarizes these conversations just like I have. But then also it frames what came next in September. What were the popular social media conversations about history education and education generally? And for those of you, like, I don't need to tell you, it's not good. Like, we are totally like in the midst of it in ways that many people felt were going back to a very traditional sense of education, going back to like teacher student at the front of the classroom. Here's the information. There isn't as much interaction. In the pandemic pedagogy conversations, we talk so much about greater approaching our history classrooms with a greater engagement with self. So like, here I am as a teacher, a human, scared, unclear about what's going on in the future. Think of how people in the past felt. Here are you as a student also feeling those feelings. Like, let's think about that. Not to mention the George Floyd murder, Breonna Taylor's murder, and the Black Lives Matter protest that came from worldwide, that came from those events. Like, how do we now process that? And so when we came back in September, that didn't seem to be the case. And so I question why that is. Why is there such a excitement about making change and like seeing changes for equity and justice and emotion and affect and person to person teaching and learning, rather than just like capital T teacher and capital S student? How do we move? How did we move back to a place of education that was even further away from that? So while in the spring of 2020, the conversation showed fear, but also possibility, what I was hearing in the conversations in fall and winter was the return to the rigidity of teaching and learning structures that do not invite the radical possibilities that we often talked about and we often were excited about in these conversations. So I question, how does large-scale educational change happen? Change that focuses on students and this emotional life worlds of understanding stories, care for teachers and care for their work, respect for their work. How does that large-scale educational change happen? And is the when, like, will it happen? Are we just too early? Are we just too deep in crisis to be able to really make those changes? Are we just like patching over this moment to ensure that we can do schooling, but really we're putting a pin in the changes that we know need to happen in 5 or 10 years? Or will 5 and 10 years be even worse? Is the wait good enough? Like, it's one thing to wait 5 years when you're an adult and you go from like, 35 to 40 or 45 to 45 or 40 to 45. It's another thing to go from 5 to 10 or 10 to 15. Like, that's a huge part of your education. How can we make the changes that we know are needed in the history and social studies classrooms? And I want to, in our last 10 minutes, to have a little bit of a conversation about that. But I also just want to recognize that change in our classrooms and large-scale educational change are two things that aren't necessarily in alignment. It wasn't in alignment before COVID, and it won't be in alignment after COVID. And so one of the things I argue in the article that I'm working on is that large structures of education are moving back to a very traditional way of teaching and learning because their focus has really been on making physical changes to the classroom, to education, so online rather than in person, and we've left people behind. So in our classrooms, is there a way we can bring engagement with people, emotion, fears, and bringing that to our history classrooms in ways that our educational changes, our educational structures don't necessarily invite? And can we do that more as we get into year 2 of COVID, which just like hurts my soul a little bit? So with that, I want to put that question out to everyone, because I think we have 10 minutes left, about what you're seeing. Are you seeing those changes? Do you have suggestions for those changes? Do you think there are ways that we should be teaching history differently after this moment? Not just should we, but will we? Like, what would that look like? Now, before I open up the room, there's so many nice people here. Well, I just assume you're nice because I see smiling faces. Is that like, I would love your feedback. Try to keep your comments a little brief so we can get to as many people as possible. But I will end the session, like in 8 minutes or whatever, inviting you to talk to me, with me, because the conversations were very much a conversation for the next series of pandemic pedagogy, which I'm hoping to start in the spring or summer, to think about what our next Septembers might look like. So even if you're like bursting to say all this stuff, like maybe you want to say it on camera for me on the video series. But right now, it'd be really great to get some of your feedback about what you think about this particular moment and how we can work for the changes that many of us see are needed.
Well, I know, hi, I know for
Hi.
me, I'm an English teacher, but I have definitely found that history has become, it's always important for me because I teach American literature. I feel like you can never really divorce history from English, in order to anchor a text in time, they need to have some kind of context. So right now it's just seems even more important to me and be more important with what's happening. I know I want to start start talking like Asian American literature, making sure I'm covering all these things, especially right now when we have such an anti-Asian backlash because of COVID. So like teaching history and then also making sure I get in the text too to really show like either fiction and like how are these lives affected, and then like the nonfiction of what is actually happening right now. It's been ever more important to me.
Yeah, and I decided for this presentation not to necessarily like talk about all of the big common themes across the videos. Like I've written a couple blog posts about them, but thank you, Marie, for that comment, because interdisciplinarity was such a huge one. I've always said like, well, first, I always think that students really care and love history. We just don't teach or present history in the ways that they are necessarily interested in. And this moment of injustice, I think students are really trying to make sense for. And engaging with literature and art is a really great way to integrate those interests and the ways that we can often, there's a historical record that's often silenced because we don't have these stories, but literature can do that. And so I really appreciate that comment coming from an English teacher and saying like how you're bringing in history, because I think so many history teachers can also be able to bring in so much greater literature to be able to really color a particular time period. So thank you for that. I don't know if you guys want to use the like little raise hand thing and then I can call on you, or if you just want to talk.